On a foggy autumn morning in the sleepy town of Cotton Ridge, traffic came to a halt not because of an accident or fallen tree, but because of a tiny golden Labrador puppy, soaking wet and trembling, standing defiantly in the middle of the road. What seemed like a lost dog turned out to be a silent cry for help. And what this puppy led them to would change lives, reunite a broken family, and remind everyone that heroes come in the smallest, furriest forms. Before we begin, tell us where in the world are you listening from? Drop your location in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and fearless paws. Morning came slow and heavy in Cotton Ridge, Oregon, as if the sleepy town itself was reluctant to wake. A thick blanket of fog drifted across the quiet hills, softening the outlines of the pine trees that bordered the winding two-lane highway. It was early autumn, and the air held that crisp bite that hinted winter wasn't far behind. Dead leaves clung to wet asphalt, and the sky hung low and gray, promising rain before midday. Officer Megan Carter had been patrolling this route for nearly 10 years. At 34, she'd become a familiar sight in her Navy sheriff's jacket, her cruiser always clean, her manner calm and steady. Megan stood at 5'9", lean from a routine of early morning jogs and late-night walks with her aging beagle. Her face was framed by soft brown hair usually pulled into a low ponytail beneath her patrol cap, and her eyes gray with flecks of green were sharp, but never unkind. People in Cotton Ridge trusted her not just because she did her job well, but because she listened, always careful to take her time before deciding anything. She had lost her younger brother to a drowning accident when she was 19, and ever since, she'd carried a quiet protectiveness in everything she did, especially when it came to vulnerable lives. That morning her shift had been uneventful. School zone patrols, a minor fender bender, one call about a suspicious raccoon. She was sipping from a thermal mug of bitter black coffee when she rounded a curve near mile marker 23 and slammed the brakes. Standing in the middle of the road, shivering and soaked, was a small golden Labrador puppy. Its fur was a mess of wet clumps, its paws muddy and tail stiff. The pup stood its ground, barking toward the woods, then toward her cruiser, then back again. It didn't flinch when the car came to a stop just yards away. Instead, it took a few steps toward the shoulder of the road, then looked back over its shoulder, barking sharply. Megan opened the door and stepped out slowly. Hey there, easy now," she called, kneeling a few feet from the pup. The Labrador cocked its head, then approached her in cautious, limping steps. It wasn't malnourished, but it was clearly exhausted, wet to the skin, trembling slightly from the cold. Up close, Megan could see the puppy was likely 6 or 7 months old, with floppy ears and deep brown eyes that held more awareness than she expected. Around its neck hung a weathered leather collar, and dangling from it was a thin, brushed silver tag. Megan reached out gently, murmuring softly, "It's okay, buddy. You alone out here?" To her surprise, the dog didn't pull away. It let her turn the tag over, and what she read sent a chill through her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. "If I'm alone, someone's in trouble, buddy." Buddy. So that was his name. Megan looked up, toward the trees. The highway curved through a thick pine forest at this point, dense, hilly, and rarely traveled on foot. No houses nearby, no trailheads, no campsites for miles. She stood, brushing her hands on her pants, and looked back at the dog. "You trying to get someone to follow you, huh?" Buddy barked again, more urgent this time, and darted a few paces toward the tree line. Then he stopped, turned back, and barked once more. Megan hesitated only a second before grabbing her radio. "Dispatch, this is Carter. I'm pulling over near mile 23. Got a stray, no injuries, but there's something odd about this one. I'm going to check the area on foot. I'll report back in 20. She clipped the radio back on her belt and nodded toward Buddy. "All right, show me." The puppy turned and took off into the brush, not running full speed, but trotting in a steady, determined gait, glancing over his shoulder every few steps to make sure Megan was following. She ducked under low branches and stepped carefully over the uneven forest floor. After about 5 minutes, they came upon a break in the tree cover where the ground was soft and muddied by recent rain. There, scattered between broken ferns, were signs of human presence: a crushed water bottle, a torn strap from a hiking pack, and something that caught her breath: a faded baseball cap lying in the dirt, heavy with moisture. Megan picked it up. It was military issue. Embroidered on the back was a name in all caps: Wallace. Her stomach sank. Frank Wallace was a name she hadn't heard in a while, but she remembered him. Vietnam veteran, lived alone in a weather-beaten cabin on the western edge of town, kept to himself mostly. Folks described him as quiet, sometimes gruff, but not unkind. He'd stopped coming to town about 3 weeks ago. Megan had assumed he'd gone off for hunting season. But now this? Buddy gave a low whimper and began to paw at the underbrush ahead. "Wait," Megan said softly, scanning the woods. "He's out here, isn't he?" She looked down at the puppy. His tail wagged just once, and his eyes locked on hers. In that moment, Megan Carter knew this was no ordinary stray. This puppy wasn't lost. He had come to find help. The fog hung heavier under the canopy as Officer Megan Carter followed Buddy deeper into the forest, her boots pressing into the soft, sponge-like earth with each cautious step. The trees thickened around them, towering pines and firs cloaked in moss and shadow. Though Megan had patrolled the outskirts of Cotton Ridge for years, she had never ventured this far off-road, and the unfamiliar silence unnerved her. Even the birds seemed to be holding their breath. Buddy padded ahead with surprising confidence for a puppy so young. His golden coat was streaked with dirt, and his small frame shivered occasionally, but he didn't slow. He moved with a purpose that Megan couldn't ignore. The trail was barely visible, an uneven path where deer had once moved through, now overtaken by fallen branches, slick rocks, and tangled undergrowth. Megan ducked beneath low-hanging limbs, occasionally brushing away spiderwebs that clung to her jacket. They hadn't gone far when she spotted the first clue: a crumpled sheet of aluminum foil glinting dully in the shadows. Megan crouched, gently lifting it with gloved fingers. It was charred around the edges, the telltale scent of burned food still lingering faintly. Someone had tried to cook here. Nearby, the ashes of a tiny fire pit barely big enough to warm 2 hands were scattered beneath the thick carpet of leaves. She scanned the ground and found boot prints pressed into the mud, heavy and erratic. They veered off sharply to the right, toward the slope. "Frank," she murmured under her breath. The name wasn't just a guess anymore. Megan had known Frank Wallace only in passing, an older man with white hair and a long beard, somewhere in his late 60s. He had deep-set eyes, and a faraway look that hinted at wars fought long ago, both overseas and within. Most people in town thought he was reclusive, even strange. But Megan had always sensed a gentleness beneath his silence, especially when she saw him at the vet clinic with injured birds or strays. He brought them in quietly, paid in cash, and left without a word. Buddy whined softly ahead. Megan rose, slipping the foil into her jacket pocket, and pressed on. The forest floor sloped downward now, and Megan tread carefully to avoid sliding on the wet leaves. Buddy led her toward a narrow gully where water had once flowed, now reduced to a muddy trickle. There, tangled in a bramble of blackberry vines, was a torn strap, its faded green color, a match for a military-style backpack. She reached in, carefully extracting it, and saw dried blood staining the canvas. Her breath hitched. "Oh no." Buddy let out a bark, not loud, but sharp, and bounded ahead. "Wait, Buddy!" Megan quickened her pace. They followed the dry creek bed for another 10 minutes before Buddy suddenly stopped, ears perked. Megan slowed behind him, and that's when she saw it. A fallen tree, its trunk covered in thick moss, lying across the narrow stream. And at the base of the log, half hidden in mud and wet leaves, was something unmistakable: a camouflage-patterned canteen, bitten at the base, leaking slowly into the earth. She knelt beside it. The cap had been chewed through, likely by an animal, and the strap was frayed. But etched faintly into the bottom was a name: Wallace. It was confirmation, chilling and solid. As Megan studied the area, Buddy began circling the log. Then he stopped suddenly and started pawing at the ground beside it. Megan moved over, brushing leaves aside, and her hand froze when she touched something soft and worn. A hat. The same hat she'd seen earlier, now resting under the log like someone had placed it there intentionally. And inside, it tucked so carefully it made her chest ache, was a bundle of wildflowers, now dry and brittle. Megan sat back on her heels, staring at it. Frank hadn't just fallen. He had stopped here, tried to survive here, maybe even hoped someone would come. Her radio crackled faintly, but she didn't answer. She was too focused, too locked in the moment. Buddy lay down beside the hat and rested his chin on it. His eyes were wide and wet, and Megan could swear the little dog looked mournful. It wasn't theatrics, it was love. Loyalty so pure, it hurt to witness. She finally spoke. "He waited here, didn't he, boy? And then you went to find help." Buddy didn't move, but he thumped his tail once against the ground. Megan stood and looked around. No body, no blood trails, thank God. That meant Frank had moved again. But where? She scanned the trees. The boot prints had continued uphill. Earlier, maybe he tried to climb out. Maybe he was still alive. She retrieved her radio. "Dispatch, this is Carter. I've confirmed evidence of a missing person, possible injury. I'm deep in the woods west of mile 23. Following further signs. We'll report again in 15. As she clipped it back onto her belt, Megan turned to Buddy. "Let's find him." The pup stood, shook himself off, and wagged his tail ready. The forest grew darker with each passing minute as the last of the overcast daylight slipped behind the tree line. Shadows stretched long and thin, the damp air growing colder. Megan Carter clicked on her flashlight, the narrow beam slicing through mist and branches. Buddy, the golden Labrador pup, still led the way, though he was slower now, his ears pinned slightly back, sensing something near. They were hours into their search, but Megan didn't question the dog's instincts anymore. He had earned her trust. Every paw step he took was deliberate, and his gaze flicked back to her often, as if to say, "We're almost there." The underbrush thickened before opening suddenly into a shallow ravine, half hidden behind a curtain of brambles and moss-draped fir limbs. The ground dipped sharply, forming a natural hollow in the earth where large boulders jutted from the soil like ancient sentinels. Megan crouched beside one of them, carefully parting the branches. Then she saw him. Frank Wallace. The old man lay wedged between two large rocks in the narrow gap of the ravine floor. His frame was thinner than Megan remembered, his skin pale beneath the grime and scraggly white beard. His right leg was twisted unnaturally, the pants torn and dried with blood. His chest rose and fell, but faintly. His eyes were closed, and a sunken look haunted his face, as though he had drifted far from consciousness. Megan scrambled down the slope, calling out, "Frank? Frank, can you hear me?" She reached his side and checked his pulse. Weak, but present. His lips were cracked, skin clammy. Dehydration, possibly days without food. His leg definitely broken, maybe more internal injuries. She pulled off her jacket and gently laid it over his chest, then tapped her radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. I've located the missing person. Male, age 68, unresponsive but breathing. Suspected leg fracture, dehydration. Location is approximately 2 miles west of highway mile marker 23 in a forest ravine. Requesting immediate medical evac, won't make it overnight." Buddy whined softly and pressed himself against Frank's side, resting his chin on the man's arm. Megan saw the slight flicker in Frank's brow. Recognition. She whispered, "He's here, Frank. Your boy came to find us." Frank's cracked lips parted, and a hoarse whisper escaped. "Buddy?" Tears prickled the corners of Megan's eyes. She knelt beside him and began unzipping his worn canvas bag, hoping to find identification, medical supplies, anything that might help. Inside, tucked among a nearly empty can of beans, a flashlight with dead batteries, and a pocket knife, was a cloth pouch. She pulled it free and opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of lined paper, yellowed at the edges and creased from being Reodor held many times. Megan hesitated, then began to read. "To Katie, if you ever read this, it means I didn't get to say it in person. I'm sorry. For everything. For the silence. For pushing you away when you were only trying to love me. After the war, I couldn't see straight, couldn't think right. The noise never stopped, even when the world around me did. I lost your mother. Then I lost myself. You deserved better. I kept telling myself I was protecting you by staying away, but that's just coward's talk. I thought maybe if I wrote this down, you'd see what I couldn't say with my mouth. I love you, always have. I just didn't know how to be a father anymore." The rest was smudged, a drop of water, maybe a tear, maybe the rain blurring the ink beyond recognition. Megan folded the letter back slowly, her hands trembling. This was more than a rescue. It was a man trying to reach redemption before it was too late. As the distant sound of a chopper's blades began to echo faintly across the valley, Buddy stood and barked once, loud and clear. Megan looked up. The rescue team was close. She could see the flicker of a flashlight in the trees above. Moments later, 2 paramedics made their way down the ravine. A tall, broad-shouldered man named Drew Taylor, mid-40s, with sun-weathered skin and a calm, commanding voice. And his partner, Lila Brooks, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 30s, quick and methodical, with chestnut hair tied into a braid down her back. They worked together seamlessly, assessing Frank's condition and preparing him for evacuation. As they placed Frank onto the stretcher, his fingers twitched, and he whispered again, "Did she get my letter?" Megan knelt and took his hand gently. "She will, I promise." Buddy didn't move from Frank's side until the last possible second, when the stretcher was lifted onto the winch. Then he sat quietly at Megan's feet, watching as the man he'd refused to give up on was carried skyward into the fading light. Frank Wallace was airlifted out of the forest, just as the first drops of evening rain began to fall, carried away from the cold earth he had nearly died on. The rotors of the medical chopper kicked up fallen pine needles and mist, and Megan stood there with Buddy, watching until the sound disappeared into the clouds. It was almost surreal how close to the edge things had been, and how a puppy, no older than 6 months, had kept hope alive. By the time Megan returned to her cruiser with Buddy curled up on the passenger seat, soaked and shivering but finally at rest, news of the rescue had already begun to spread. She had sent a report, of course, but someone from the EMT team had snapped a photo. Megan in the woods, crouched over the injured veteran, with the golden pup standing guard. That image made its way to local news within the hour. Cotton Ridge was a small town. Word traveled faster than wildfire. At St. Elora Medical Center, 30 miles east of the forest, Frank was rushed into emergency surgery. 2 broken ribs, a fractured leg, dehydration, and a mild infection from a wound on his lower back. The doctors, led by Dr. James Colton, a stern but soft-spoken man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a quiet way of giving bad news, said it was a miracle Frank had survived at all. Back at the hospital's front desk, a young nurse named Emily Hayes, 24, with curly red hair and freckles scattered across her nose like cinnamon dust, was organizing incoming calls. She had a warm voice, the kind that made even the worst news seem less sharp. When she answered a call from a woman named Katie Wallace, she immediately recognized the urgency in the voice on the other end. Katie, 31 years old, lived in Portland and hadn't spoken to her father in over a decade. She was tall, athletic, with straight black hair she always wore in a loose braid down her back. Once a middle school art teacher, Katie had given up teaching after her mother's death and her father's sudden withdrawal from her life. She had grown used to living with that silence until now. "I need to see him," Katie said to the nurse. "Tonight, if I can." An hour later, Katie walked into room 412. Frank was barely awake, hooked to machines and IV drips, a cast on his leg, bruises down his arms. His eyes fluttered open when she approached the bed. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, in a breath that was almost broken, "Katie, I wasn't sure you'd come." Katie didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned toward the figure curled up at the foot of the hospital bed, Buddy, freshly cleaned and wrapped in a soft towel, his tail giving a slow, sleepy wag. Katie knelt beside him, reached out, and gently ran a hand along his soft ears. Then she pulled him into her arms and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for not leaving him, even when I did." The room went still. Frank's hand trembled as he reached out across the bed. Katie hesitated for just a second, then placed her hand in his. Their fingers intertwined, unsure, tentative, and then firmly, like the weight of 12 lost years being lifted in one silent motion. In the hallway, Megan stood quietly by the window, watching the raindrops race each other down the glass. She had stayed to make sure Buddy was admitted with Frank officially listed as a therapy companion. Megan wasn't one for attention, but when the news vans arrived outside the hospital, she couldn't avoid it. By morning, the story was everywhere. Local dog rescues, owner lost in woods. Veteran saved by loyal pup, after days alone in wilderness. If I'm alone, someone's in trouble, the dog tag that led to a miracle. Reporters lined up outside the hospital, and strangers left food, flowers, and toys for Buddy at the entrance desk. Social media erupted with hashtags like #BraveBuddy and #Loyal to the End. Animal shelters received a surge in adoption inquiries. Parents used the story to teach their kids about love and responsibility. Even regional networks began calling in for interviews. But inside room 412, none of that mattered. Frank was alive. Katie was there. And Buddy, curled contentedly at the foot of the bed, was where he belonged. That evening, Megan brought in a small box, worn wooden and sealed with a metal clasp. "We found this in your father's pack," she said gently, handing it to Katie. Inside was the letter, still creased, still stained, but now a bridge between the man Frank had once been and the man he hoped to become again. Katie sat with her father into the night, reading it aloud, letting each sentence pour into the space between them that silence had once claimed. And Buddy? He lay between them both, head resting on his paws, breathing slow and peaceful. Autumn lingered over Cotton Ridge like a gentle memory, casting golden light across amber leaves and coating the air with the scent of wood smoke and pine. The town had changed in the days since the rescue. Conversations in diners were no longer about gas prices or weather forecasts, but about the little golden Labrador who had done what few believed possible. Everywhere, people whispered the name Buddy with reverence, as if he were something more than just a dog, something sacred. Frank Wallace remained at St. Elora Medical Center for nearly 2 weeks, recovering slowly but steadily under the careful attention of his medical team. With each passing day, the strength returned to his voice, the color returned to his cheeks, and the hollowed look in his eyes softened when Katie came into the room. He no longer looked like a man lost in time. Katie had moved into a small rental house on Hawthorne Street, just 5 minutes from the hospital. The cozy one-story home, painted pale blue with white shutters, was a temporary stop while she looked for a place closer to her father's. She had taken a leave of absence from her art coordinator job in Portland, though anyone who spoke to her could tell she wasn't planning to return. She wore less makeup now, her long black braid often draped over her flannel shirts like a soft question mark, and her voice, once guarded, had grown warm again. Buddy was always by her side, following her from room to room, curling at her feet during late-night phone calls or licking away the occasional tear she didn't expect to shed. Frank's discharge day brought a quiet celebration. Emily Hayes, the freckled nurse with cinnamon-colored curls, was there to wheel him to the lobby. Buddy walked beside the wheelchair, proudly wearing a red vest gifted by the hospital staff that read, "Certified Emotional Support Animal." The moment Frank's boots touched the pavement outside, the hospital doors slid open, and the world welcomed him back. For a man who once lived in near-total solitude, the change was overwhelming but not unwelcome. A week later, Mayor Douglas Martinan, affable man in his 60s with silver hair and a love for dramatic speeches, announced a special town gathering to honor Buddy. The ceremony would be held at the Cotton Ridge Town Green, beneath the great oak tree where the founder's bell was rung every 4th of July. A makeshift stage was built. Banners were strung between lampposts. Children practiced songs in their classrooms, and the local bakery created Buddy biscuits in the shape of golden pups. Megan Carter, the officer whose instincts had saved a life, was asked to lead the event. She had hesitated. At first, attention was not something she enjoyed, but ultimately agreed. She spent the morning of the event in her modest apartment above the firehouse, pressing her uniform and brushing her hair back into its usual tight ponytail. In the mirror, her reflection looked the same as ever, calm, composed, but inside, something had shifted. The silence she had carried since her brother's death no longer echoed as loudly. Something about the way Buddy had trusted her, without hesitation, had stirred something buried deep. That afternoon, the entire town turned out. Parents held toddlers on their shoulders, elderly couples sat wrapped in blankets, and teens leaned on bicycles with sheepish grins. At precisely 3 o'clock, Megan stepped up to the microphone. She stood straight, looking out at the crowd, then down at the front row where Frank sat in a wheelchair, Katie standing behind him and Buddy resting between them. Megan smiled and began. "There are stories that remind us of bravery," she said. "There are stories that remind us of love. But every so often, we're given a story that reminds us what it means to hope. And in this town, this quiet place in the Hillsway found that story in a dog." She paused, her eyes finding Buddy's. He didn't speak. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He just acted purely, instinctively, and with a heart bigger than any I've ever seen. Megan bent slightly and pulled a small box from the podium. She opened it to reveal a handcrafted bronze medal in the shape of a paw print, inscribed with the words, "For loyalty beyond measure." She gestured toward the stage. "Buddy, would you come forward?" Katie gave a gentle tug on the leash, and Buddy trotted up the steps, tail wagging. Megan knelt as she clipped the medal to his vest. The entire town stood in unison and erupted into applause. Some people cried. Others cheered. For a full minute, the sound of hands clapping filled the open field like a heartbeat. And then, as the noise began to fade, Megan leaned in close and whispered, not just to Buddy, but perhaps to herself, "We don't always need miracles. Sometimes, one little dog is enough." Buddy licked her cheek once, then sat proudly beside her as cameras flashed and laughter rippled through the crowd. By sunset, the oak tree's shadow stretched across the grass, and families slowly trickled home, their hearts a little fuller than before. Frank sat quietly in his chair, Katie's hand resting on his shoulder. He watched the dog that had saved him run across the lawn, playing with children and accepting treats like a humble celebrity. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about healing. And healing, as Megan had come to learn, often arrived on 4 legs and in silence. Sometimes the smallest hearts carry the greatest courage. Buddy didn't have a voice, but he didn't need one. Through his loyalty, determination, and love, he reminded an entire town and a broken family what it means to never give up on someone. It wasn't just about rescue. It was about healing, reconnection, and the quiet power of faithfulness. So the next time you see a stray or feel overlooked, remember, even the smallest creature might be carrying the weight of a miracle. Be kind, pay attention, and believe in second chances. If this story touched you, let us know where in the world you're listening from. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who believes in the goodness of animals, because sometimes a little dog with a big heart is all it takes to change everything.